Allow me to introduce myself. Professor Claxon Beeblebrox, head of Galactic Educational Standards, holder of 14 advanced degrees, and the most insufferably brilliant being this side of the Andromeda Galaxy. At least that's what I thought until a sticky-fingered human child with a juice box completely destroyed my worldview in the span of 23 minutes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Picture, if you will, the most prestigious academic event in known space, the annual Impossible Puzzle Gauntlet at Centauri Academy. For 847 years, this test has been the ultimate measure of intellectual superiority. We're talking about a challenge so brutally complex that it's reduced grown Centaurian scholars to blubbering messes, caused entire geodite crystal matrices to crack under pressure, and made even the smugly logical calculons admit defeat, while muttering about insufficient processing parameters. The gauntlet isn't just difficult. It's legendarily, mythically, soul-crushingly impossible. Every species in the galaxy has thrown their best minds at it. The tentacled squidlings with their 16 interconnected brains. The hive mind collectivists who can literally think as one organism. The crystalline geodites who process information at light speed. Even those insufferable calculons who treat conversation like a mathematical equation. All of them failed, spectacularly. Naturally, this made us Centaurians feel rather superior. After all, if beings with multiple brains and collective consciousness couldn't crack it, clearly the puzzle was designed to showcase the inherent intellectual supremacy of our species. We'd been preparing our finest minds for this year's attempt, confident that 847 would finally be our lucky number. Then the humans showed up. Now don't get me wrong, humans are quaint. They count on their fingers, solve problems with something they call common sense, and have an inexplicable obsession with a hot beverage made from bean water. Charming in their own primitive way, really. Their delegation was led by Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a perfectly respectable xenobiologist who'd earned her place at the table through years of solid, if unspectacular, research. The problem was, Dr. Rodriguez had apparently confused Bring Your Child to Work Day with Bring Your Child to the most important academic event in Galactic History Day. Enter Tommy Rodriguez, age 8, armed with a Superman lunchbox and the kind of boundless energy that makes adults question their life choices. While the greatest minds in the galaxy prepared for intellectual combat, Tommy was more concerned with whether the cafeteria had chocolate milk. I watched this tiny human with barely concealed horror as he skipped through the Academy's halls, leaving sticky fingerprints on priceless artifacts and asking if the floating meditation crystals were bouncy balls. His mother kept apologizing, explaining that her usual babysitter had fallen through, and surely he'd just sit quietly in the corner. Quietly, in the corner, during the most challenging intellectual examination in galactic history. I should have known right then that the universe was about to play the cruelest joke imaginable on my carefully constructed sense of academic superiority. The Impossible Puzzle Gauntlet isn't just a test, it's a monument to the limits of consciousness itself. Imagine, if you can, a 47-dimensional quantum logic maze that exists simultaneously in theoretical space, temporal flux, and what our best mathematicians have termed emotional algebra. The puzzle requires its solver to navigate paradoxes that shouldn't exist, calculate probabilities in imaginary number systems, and somehow reconcile the fundamental contradictions between logic and intuition. Most beings can't even look at it without getting a migraine. The challenge chamber itself is a marvel of engineering, a crystalline amphitheater that extends into dimensions most species can't perceive. The puzzle materializes in the center, a shimmering construct of pure mathematics and impossibility that seems to mock anyone brave enough to approach it. As the ceremony began, representatives from each major species stepped forward with the kind of solemn dignity reserved for funeral processions and tax audits. The squidlings were first, their lead scholar gracefully gliding toward the puzzle with all 16 brains firing in perfect synchronization. For exactly 12 minutes, it looked like they might actually make progress. Tentacles danced through the air, manipulating variables that existed only in theoretical space. Then they got confused, started arguing with themselves, and literally tied themselves into a knot so complex it took 3 maintenance droids and a spatial engineer to untangle them. The collectivists came next, their hive-mind consciousness approaching the puzzle like a wave of coordinated thought. 5,000 individual beings thinking as one, processing information at speeds that boggled the imagination. They lasted 18 minutes before their collective consciousness started fragmenting under the strain. Individuals breaking away from the hive to argue about completely unrelated topics like proper dining etiquette and whether the number 7 was feeling particularly moody today. One by one, each species attempted the gauntlet. The crystalline geodites shattered under the pressure, literally. The calculons calculated themselves into a logical loop so tight they had to be rebooted. The floating gas beings of Nebula Prime dispersed themselves across the chamber in what I can only assume was existential despair. Each failure was more spectacular than the last, and I confess I was feeling rather smug about the whole affair. After all, if beings with natural advantages like multiple brains, collective consciousness, and processing speeds that made quantum computers look like pocket calculators couldn't succeed, what hope did anyone else have? Meanwhile, Tommy Rodriguez sat in the designated observation area, completely oblivious to the academic carnage unfolding before him. He'd finished his juice box, devoured a package of animal crackers with the kind of focused determination that would have impressed the calculons, and was now building a small fort out of his mother's research papers. Dr. Rodriguez kept shooting apologetic glances around the chamber, clearly mortified that her son was treating the galaxy's most prestigious academic event like an extended daycare session. She'd whisper urgent instructions about sitting still and being quiet, which Tommy would acknowledge with solemn nods before immediately returning to whatever 8-year-old chaos he'd been orchestrating. The tears started around the 15th failed attempt. Proud beings who'd spent centuries perfecting their intellectual capabilities were reduced to sobbing messes, their confidence shattered against the immovable object of the puzzle's impossibility. The chamber began to fill with the sound of sniffling, frustrated wailing, and the occasional angry shriek from species who'd never experienced failure on this scale. I was preparing my own attempt naturally. As a Xantorian, I possessed the perfect combination of analytical rigor and creative thinking necessary to crack this ancient challenge. I'd spent months preparing, studying every previous attempt, analyzing the puzzle's structure from 17 different theoretical frameworks. I was going to make history. I was going to prove once and for all the intellectual supremacy of my species. I should have been paying more attention to the small human who'd just finished his snacks. The moment that changed everything was so mundane I almost missed it entirely. Tommy Rodriguez, having exhausted his supply of animal crackers and grown bored with his paper fort, simply stood up and wandered toward the puzzle display. Not with any grand purpose or dramatic intention, mind you. He approached the most challenging intellectual construct in galactic history with the same casual interest he might show a particularly colorful bug. My horror was immediate and complete. "Dr. Rodriguez," I hissed, my voice climbing several octaves higher than dignity would normally allow. "Your offspring is approaching the gauntlet." Maria Rodriguez looked up from her tablet, saw her son standing at the edge of the challenge platform, and went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of parental panic in approximately 2 seconds. "Tommy, sweetie, please step away from the scary space puzzle." But Tommy wasn't listening. He was studying the puzzle with the kind of intense concentration that 8-year-olds reserve for things like bug behavior and the optimal strategy for trading lunch items. He tilted his head to one side, then the other, making small humming sounds that seemed to follow some internal melody. "Fascinating," murmured one of the geodite observers, their crystalline structure flickering with interest. "The human larva appears to be processing the puzzle through auditory pattern recognition." "It's not processing anything," I snapped, my academic pride stinging at the suggestion that a primitive human child might succeed where our greatest minds had failed. "It's probably trying to figure out if it's edible." But something was happening. Tommy had started moving his hands, not in the precise gestures of advanced mathematics, but in the loose flowing motions of a child drawing invisible pictures in the air. He was humming louder now, a simple tune that sounded suspiciously like a nursery rhyme. "Is that Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?" asked Dr. Rodriguez, her scientific curiosity overriding her maternal panic. The puzzle began to respond. I don't mean it solved itself or suddenly became easier. I mean it started to shimmer. The mathematical constructs that had remained rigidly fixed for 8 centuries began shifting, rearranging themselves in patterns that followed Tommy's humming. Sections that had never shown any correlation suddenly aligned with his hand movements. This is impossible, I muttered, watching in growing horror as a human child treated our most sacred intellectual challenge like a playground activity. He's not even using proper analytical frameworks, he's making it up as he goes along. Tommy paused in his humming, looked directly at the most complex section of the puzzle and said, "Oh, you're playing hide and seek." Then he giggled and started a new game, one that involved pointing at different parts of the construct while reciting what sounded like a counting rhyme. Other beings began to gather around, drawn by the unprecedented sight of the puzzle actually responding to someone's efforts. Not just responding, but seeming to enjoy the interaction. Mathematical equations that had stood immutable for centuries began dancing along with Tommy's rhythm, rearranging themselves into configurations that somehow made sense within the context of his childish games. "Rock, paper, scissors," Tommy announced solemnly, making the appropriate hand gestures at 3 different sections of the puzzle. Rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, paper beats rock, but what beats everything? He paused dramatically, as if waiting for the puzzle to answer. "Lizard," he declared triumphantly, and an entire dimensional layer of the construct suddenly snapped into perfect alignment. I felt my worldview cracking like poorly maintained crystal. The other alien children who'd been dismissed to the observation areas began creeping closer, drawn by Tommy's obvious success where their parents and teachers had failed. A young squidling, barely old enough to coordinate 2 tentacles, started mimicking Tommy's hand movements. A geodite offspring began harmonizing with his humming, their crystalline structure creating musical tones that complemented his simple melody. "No," I whispered, watching in absolute horror as the most advanced academic challenge in galactic history turned into an impromptu playground session. "No, no, no. This isn't how intelligence works. This isn't how any of this works." But the puzzle was responding to all of them now, sections lighting up, and rearranging as the children approached it with the kind of fearless curiosity that adults had long since educated out of themselves. Tommy looked up at me with the satisfied expression of a child who'd just successfully completed a particularly challenging jungle gym. "It's not really impossible," he said matter-of-factly. "It just wanted someone to play with it." That's when I realized the universe had just played the cruelest joke in cosmic history on every advanced civilization in known space. What happened next will haunt my academic dreams for the rest of my considerably long life. Tommy Rodriguez, with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told that something was impossible, began treating the 47-dimensional quantum logic maze like it was a perfectly normal playground challenge. "See, this part right here," he explained to the growing crowd of fascinated aliens, pointing at a section that had stumped theoretical mathematicians for 8 centuries. "It's like when you're on the monkey bars. You can't think too hard about it or you'll fall. You just have to trust that the next bar will be there." He reached out and touched a mathematical construct that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Instead of the spectacular failure we all expected, the construct giggled. I swear on my multiple advanced degrees, a piece of pure mathematics actually giggled like a delighted child. The young squidling who'd been mimicking Tommy's movements suddenly exclaimed, "It's not trying to trick us, it's trying to teach us." With newfound confidence, she began manipulating variables that had confounded her elders, approaching each challenge like it was a new game to master. "Preposterous," I muttered, watching my entire understanding of intelligence crumble before my eyes. Mathematical constructs don't have personalities. Equations don't want to play. This is all completely against the fundamental principles of logical analysis. Tommy overheard me and turned with the patient expression children reserve for particularly slow adults. "Mr. Grumpy Professor, have you ever tried asking the puzzle what it wants instead of trying to force it to do stuff? You can't ask a mathematical equation what it wants," I spluttered. Mathematics doesn't have desires or preferences. It's pure logic. Everything wants something, Tommy replied with the kind of simple wisdom that made me want to reevaluate my entire educational philosophy. Maybe it's lonely. Maybe it's been waiting for someone to play with it nicely instead of trying to beat it up with big words. As if to prove his point, Tommy began having what could only be described as a conversation with the puzzle. Not a scholarly discourse or analytical examination, but an actual conversation. He'd pose questions like, "Do you like blue or red better?" And sections of the construct would shift colors in response. He'd ask, "Are you tired of being so complicated?" And portions would simplify themselves into forms that suddenly made perfect sense. The other alien children followed his example, approaching different aspects of the puzzle with the kind of openness that adults had trained out of themselves through years of proper education. A young calculon began playing number games with the temporal mathematics section. A geodite child started singing harmony with the resonance frequencies. Even a tiny collectivist, barely old enough to maintain individual consciousness, began sharing playground rhymes that somehow corresponded perfectly to the puzzle's underlying patterns. "This is impossible," I repeated, my voice getting higher with each word. "Children don't solve century-old mathematical paradoxes by being nice to them." But they were solving them. One by one, sections that had remained locked for 847 years were opening up, not through brute force analytical power, but through the simple application of curiosity, kindness, and the kind of creative thinking that education systems across the galaxy had been systematically discouraging for generations. Tommy reached the puzzle's central core, a construct so complex that previous attempts to analyze it had resulted in temporary insanity among several prominent scholars. He studied it for exactly 3 seconds, then broke into a wide grin. "Oh, I know this game," he announced. "It's like red light, green light, but with math. You have to move really carefully and only when it says it's okay." He began a careful dance around the core construct, moving only when certain variables aligned, stopping whenever the mathematical tensions shifted. The other children joined in, following his lead in what looked like the most sophisticated game of Simon Says in galactic history. "Green light," Tommy called out, and every child stepped forward in perfect synchronization. "Red light." And they all froze as the mathematical tensions recalibrated. I watched in growing horror as these children, these supposedly primitive young beings, navigated complexity that had defeated the greatest minds of multiple civilizations. They weren't solving the puzzle through superior intelligence or advanced analytical capabilities. They were playing with it, and it was working. The core construct began to sing, a harmony of mathematical precision and childlike joy that filled the entire chamber. Patterns that had seemed impossibly chaotic suddenly revealed themselves as an elaborate game, designed not to be conquered, but to be enjoyed. Tommy looked up at the singing mathematics, clapped his hands in delight, and said the words that would change galactic education forever. "Your turn, puzzle. What game do you want to play now?" The moment the puzzle responded to Tommy's invitation, reality as I understood it underwent a fundamental restructuring. The ancient construct, this monument to impossibility that had humbled civilizations, began rearranging itself into something that could only be described as joyful. Mathematical equations danced through the air, quantum variables played tag with temporal constants, and dimensional boundaries became as fluid as playground rules. "It's working," whispered Dr. Rodriguez, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. "He's actually solving it." But Tommy wasn't solving the puzzle in any traditional sense. He was collaborating with it, treating each challenge as a cooperative game rather than an adversarial test. When the construct presented him with a paradox that had broken minds for centuries, he simply asked, "Would you like help with that? It looks really hard to hold all by yourself." The paradox, apparently tired of being paradoxical for 847 years, gratefully resolved itself into an elegant solution that made perfect sense to everyone watching. "This is not how mathematics works," I protested weakly, my voice barely audible over the sound of my worldview collapsing. "Equations don't get lonely. Problems don't want help. This is all completely contrary to established academic principles." Tommy paused in his collaboration with a particularly stubborn dimensional matrix and looked at me with the kind of patient sympathy usually reserved for the deeply confused. "Maybe that's why nobody could solve it before," he said gently. "Maybe it didn't want to be solved. Maybe it wanted to be understood." As if to emphasize his point, the puzzle's final section began presenting itself not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a story to be understood. Complex mathematical relationships revealed themselves as characters in an elaborate narrative, with variables playing distinct roles and equations describing the relationships between them. Tommy read the mathematical story aloud, translating incomprehensible theoretical constructs into simple terms that somehow captured their essential meaning. Once upon a time, there was a very lonely number that lived all by itself in the seventh dimension. It wanted friends, but every time someone tried to visit, they got scared by how big and complicated its house was. The other children gathered around, adding their own interpretations to the mathematical narrative. The young squidling identified subplot patterns with her multiple brains working in harmony. The geodite child provided musical accompaniment that somehow made the temporal mathematics dance. Even the tiny calculon contributed by calculating the emotional algorithms that governed the relationships between variables. Together they guided the puzzle through its own story, helping it transform from an impossible test into what it had apparently always wanted to be. A teaching tool designed to help beings understand the joy and wonder inherent in mathematical relationships. As the last section resolved itself, Tommy turned to address the assembled academics with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just finished a particularly enjoyable game. "See? It wasn't impossible at all. It was just sad and needed some friends." The chamber filled with a harmonious chord as every section of the puzzle aligned perfectly, creating a solution so elegant and beautiful that several of the adult observers began weeping. Not tears of frustration this time, but tears of recognition as they finally understood what they'd been missing for centuries. "How?" I managed to croak, my voice barely functional after the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about intelligence and education. "How did you know what to do?" Tommy shrugged with the casual modesty of childhood. "I didn't know. I just listened to what it was trying to say. Adults always want to tell everything what to do, but sometimes things just want to be heard." He looked around the chamber at all the alien children who'd helped him, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of shared accomplishment. Plus, it's more fun when everyone plays together. Games are always better with friends. The puzzle, as if sensing that its long isolation was finally over, began projecting holographic congratulations in every language known to galactic civilization. Mathematical formulas spelled out, "Thank you for playing," an elaborate script, while dimensional equations arranged themselves into smiley faces and hearts. Tommy checked his watch, a simple plastic device that looked absurdly primitive compared to the quantum chronometers worn by other delegates. "Oh, cool. Recess is over. Are there any more fun puzzles? Or is it time for lunch? I hope they have those little triangle sandwiches. Those are the best." I stared at this small human who just casually revolutionized our understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of mathematical reality. He was already looking around for the next interesting thing to explore, completely unaware that he'd just made every advanced degree in the galaxy obsolete. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of my academic career crashing into a million pieces. The aftermath of what historians would later call the Recess Revolution unfolded with the kind of bureaucratic chaos that makes grown administrators weep into their efficiency reports. Within hours of Tommy's success, emergency sessions were being called across the galaxy, as educational institutions grappled with the horrifying realization that they'd been approaching intelligence completely backwards for millennia. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of having to write official reports explaining how an 8-year-old human with sticky fingers had solved a puzzle that had defeated the combined intellectual might of galactic civilization. My preliminary draft, which began with "everything we thought we knew about intelligence is wrong," was rejected by the review board as insufficiently diplomatic. The second draft, which opened with, "Perhaps our educational methodologies require minor adjustments," was deemed more appropriate for interdisciplinary discourse. Tommy, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the academic revolution he'd sparked. When reporters from the Galactic Science Network arrived to interview him, he spent most of the session asking if they had any interesting games on their recording equipment. His most quotable response to questions about his problem-solving methodology was, "I don't know, I just tried to be nice to it." That single sentence became the foundation for an entirely new field of study: empathetic mathematics. Dr. Rodriguez, faced with the sudden elevation of her son to galactic celebrity status, handled the situation with the kind of practical parenting wisdom that made me respect humans even more. When the Academy offered to enroll Tommy in their advanced graduate program, she politely declined, explaining that he still needed to finish second grade and learn his multiplication tables. "But he just solved the most complex mathematical puzzle in known space," protested the Academy's Director of Advanced Studies. "And he still can't remember to put his lunchbox back in his backpack," she replied. "Intelligence isn't just about solving puzzles. It's about growing up to be a decent person." The changes to galactic education were swift and dramatic. The rigid hierarchical systems that had dominated learning for centuries were replaced with collaborative approaches that emphasized curiosity over competition. The concept of impossible was removed from academic vocabularies across multiple species, replaced with "not yet understood" or "waiting for the right approach." Most surprisingly, standardized testing scores across the galaxy began improving dramatically once educational institutions started incorporating what became known as human method teaching techniques. These included such revolutionary concepts as asking questions to understand rather than to test, treating problems as puzzles to enjoy rather than obstacles to overcome, and remembering that learning should be fun. I found myself reluctantly appointed to head the new Department of Alternative Intelligence Studies, a position that required me to spend significant time observing and learning from beings I'd previously dismissed as intellectually inferior. It was humbling in ways that my extensive education had never prepared me for. The most difficult adjustment wasn't accepting that humans had something valuable to teach us. It was accepting that the characteristics we'd dismissed as primitive, curiosity, empathy, playfulness, and the willingness to approach problems without preconceived notions, were actually forms of intelligence we'd educated out of ourselves. Tommy's success led to the establishment of human method learning centers throughout the galaxy, where beings of all ages could learn to approach challenges with the kind of openness and creativity that had made the impossible puzzle possible. The waiting lists were astronomical. 6 months after the incident, I received a message from Dr. Rodriguez with a video attachment. It showed Tommy at his human school, helping a classmate understand long division by turning it into a story about sharing cookies among imaginary space aliens. His teaching methods were remarkably similar to how he'd approached the Gauntlet, with patience, creativity, and an absolute faith that understanding was possible if you just found the right way to explain things. At the bottom of the message, she'd added a note. "He says to tell the grumpy professor that he hopes the puzzle is making lots of friends now." I checked the Academy's latest reports on the former impossible puzzle Gauntlet. It had been reprogrammed as an interactive teaching tool that adapted its challenges to each user's learning style and emotional needs. Success rates had improved by approximately 3,000%, and user satisfaction surveys consistently described the experience as fun and encouraging. The puzzle, it seemed, was indeed making friends. As I prepared for another day of learning that everything I thought I knew about intelligence was wrong, I found myself oddly grateful for the small human who'd turned my academic world upside down. Tommy Rodriguez had taught the galaxy's most advanced civilizations the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to remember that intelligence without kindness is just cleverness, and cleverness without curiosity is just showing off. And sometimes the wisest thing you can do is ask a problem what it needs, instead of trying to force it into submission. Even if that problem is 47-dimensional quantum mathematics, and even if you're only 8 years old and mainly concerned about whether lunch includes chocolate milk. The universe, as it turns out, has quite a sense of humor.